British Petroleum is one of the world's most illustrious energy corporations, synonymous with global scale, geopolitical influence, and environmental controversy. Its power was initially built by the British government, starting with the discovery of oil in Persia in 1908 and consolidated when Winston Churchill purchased a controlling stake in 1914 to fuel the Royal Navy spanning over a century. BP has shaped British foreign policy in the Middle East and expanded its operations globally. Its legacy includes strategic assets such as the Forties oil field in the North Sea and joint ventures in Alaska. Despite its financial success, the company's history is overshadowed by major crises, including the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat and the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster, the largest marine oil spill in history. William Knox Darcy was not an oil man. He was a fabulously wealthy socialite who had made his fortune in the 1880s from a literal mountain of gold in Queensland, Australia. By 1900, he was living in London, a fixture of the elite, but he was bored, and he was convinced the gold market was saturated. He was looking for his next great gamble. That gamble was presented to him by a group of British diplomats and adventurers. The prize was Persia, the nation now known as Iran. Persia at the turn of the 20th century was a failing state, ruled by the corrupt and bankrupt Qajar dynasty. The Shah, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar, was a notorious spendthrift, desperate for Western cash to fund his lavish trips to Europe. In 1901, Darcy, the British speculator, struck a deal. It was one of the most lopsided and exploitative contracts in colonial history. For a cash payment of just £20,000, a small share of future profits, and a promise to pay the Persian government 16% of net profits, Darcy was granted an exclusive 60-year concession to discover, exploit, develop, render suitable for trade, carry away and sell all petroleum, natural gas, asphalt, and azocharite throughout the entire Persian Empire, an area of 480,000 square miles. It was, in effect, a deed of ownership for the entire undiscovered oil wealth of a nation. Darcy, who had never set foot in Persia, began his dark past of exploitation. He sent his geologists into the remote, barren Zagros Mountains. For the next 7 years, the gamble was a catastrophic failure. Darcy's drill teams, led by George B. Reynolds, battled extreme heat, disease, and hostile tribes. They drilled dry hole after dry hole. By 1907, William Darcy was personally bankrupt. He had spent his entire Australian gold fortune, over £500,000, on this failed Persian venture. He was desperate. To save his concession, he was forced to turn to the Burma Oil Company for a bailout, ceding a large portion of his control. In May 1908, with the financial backers in London having sent a final telegram ordering Reynolds to cease work, dismiss staff, and abandon the search, the drill bit at Masjid Suleiman struck oil. It was not just oil. It was a gusher, a spectacular 50-foot fountain of crude that signaled the discovery of the first great oil field in the Middle East. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was immediately formed in 1909 to exploit the find. But this victory was also the birth of the dynasty's central, violent conflict. The Persian people, who were in the midst of their own constitutional revolution against the Shah, saw this deal for what it was, the theft of their national resources. The 16% of net profit clause was a financial joke, as APOC would, for the next 50 years, use creative accounting, inflated costs, management fees, and shipping charges to ensure that the net profit was almost zero. The Persian government was paid, by some estimates, as little as 2% of the real value of the oil being extracted. This original sin of exploitation, This foundation of colonial arrogance would fester for decades, eventually leading to the 1951 nationalization crisis. But in the 1910s, APOC had a different problem. It had the oil, but it had no market. It was a small, struggling producer, overshadowed by Shell and the Standard Oil giants. It was on the verge of failure for a second time. It was saved by the British government. In 1911, Winston Churchill became the First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. Churchill was a visionary, and he was making a terrifying strategic pivot. He had decreed that the entire British fleet, the source of all British imperial power, must convert from Welsh coal to oil. This created a national security crisis. Britain had coal. It had no oil. The Royal Navy was now 100% dependent on foreign corporations, namely Shell and Standard Oil, for its very survival. Churchill, a staunch imperialist, found this unacceptable. He needed a British source of oil, a captive supply that he could control. He found it in the struggling Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In 1914, just months before the outbreak of World War I, Churchill stood before Parliament and, in a masterful speech, convinced them to make one of the most significant deals in history. The British government, for a sum of £2.2 million, would purchase 51% in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This was a revolutionary moment. The BP dynasty was born. It was not a private company. It was now a state-owned enterprise, a national champion, whose primary purpose was not to generate profit for shareholders, but to provide cheap, guaranteed fuel for the Royal Navy. This government partnership, which would define the company for the next 70 years, was both its greatest strength and the source of its deepest corruption. When World War I began, APOC's tankers, fueled by Persian oil, kept the British fleet moving, playing a crucial role in the Allied victory. The company's profits exploded. But in 1933, the old one-sided 1901 concession was set to be renegotiated. Reza Shah Pahlavi, the new strongman leader of Iran, was furious at the decades of exploitation. He demanded a new, fairer deal. The company, now renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, was in a panic. Its 51% government partner was its enforcer. The British government allegedly used a combination of gunboat diplomacy and, according to historical reports, outright bribery of the Shah's officials to force a new deal. The 1933 concession was another colonial sham on paper. It raised Iran's share. In reality, it extended the company's monopoly for another 60 years to 1993. It locked in the same exploitative accounting, ensuring that the vast majority of Iran's wealth would continue to flow directly to London, to the British government's treasury, and to AIOC's shareholders. This was the dark past of the dynasty. It was a state-sponsored robber baron, using the power of the Royal Navy and political corruption to maintain its iron grip on a foreign nation's only resource. This corrupt colonial model was perfected during World War II. The Abadan refinery in Iran, now the largest in the world, became the primary fuel tank for the entire Allied war effort in the Mediterranean and Asia. The company's contribution to the defeat of the Nazis was immense. But in the post-war world, the old colonial order was dying. Nationalism was sweeping the globe. And in Iran, a new charismatic, democratically elected prime minister had risen to power. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh, a fiery nationalist, looked at the 1933 agreement and saw it for what it was: theft. He saw that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was paying more in income tax to the British government than it was paying in royalties to Iran, the country from which it was extracting the wealth. In 1951, after AIOC arrogantly refused any meaningful renegotiation, Mossadegh did the unthinkable. He passed a law, backed by a unanimous parliament, to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He seized the Ibadan refinery. He expelled the British technicians. He declared that Iran's oil now belonged to the people of Iran. This was the greatest crisis in the dynasty's history. It had lost its crown jewel, its sole source of crude, which represented 50% of its entire global production. The company's stock collapsed. The BP dynasty was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. But the dynasty did not just have shareholders, it had a state. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, was apoplectic. This was not a business dispute. It was a geopolitical catastrophe. AIOC, with the full backing of the British government, immediately launched a global blockade. They organized the other 7 sisters to boycott all Iranian oil. No company would buy it. No tanker would ship it. They were going to strangle Mossadegh financially, but Mossadegh, backed by his people, refused to break. By 1953, the British government realized the blockade was failing. They turned to their new junior partner in the Cold War, the United States and its Central Intelligence Agency. What happened next was one of the most infamous and best documented conspiracy theories in modern history, one that was proven to be true by declassified CIA documents. In 2013, MI6 and the CIA, in a joint operation codenamed Operation Ajax, organized a military coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh. The CIA, led by Agent Kermit Roosevelt Jr., bribed Iranian politicians, army officers, and street gangs. They planted black propaganda in the press, painting Mossadegh as a communist and a madman. When the first coup attempt failed, they organized a second, using paid-for mobs to storm the streets, creating a wave of chaos. Mossadegh was arrested. The democratic government was destroyed. The Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, who had fled the country in terror, was flown back and reinstalled on the throne by the CIA and MI6. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had won. It had used the intelligence agencies of 2 of the world's great powers as its private regime change army to destroy a democracy that had dared to take back its own property. The dynasty got its oil back, although it was now forced to share it in a new consortium with its American sisters. The company in 1954 was rebranded with a new, cleaner name, the British Petroleum Company, or BPP. This was the legacy of the dynasty's dark past. It was a company that had been born from a corrupt concession, saved by the British military and restored to power by a CYE coup. It was a dynasty that had learned unequivocally that its power did not come from the free market. It came from its unbreakable and often secret alliance with the state. This was the philosophy that would define its rise to a global seven-sister and, ultimately, lead it to the catastrophes of the 21st century, from Texas City to the tundra. But this was not a return to the old days. The world had changed. The 50-year-old dark past of British colonial dominance was over. AIOC, the family firm, was forced to accept a new humiliating reality. They no longer had a 100% monopoly on Iran's oil. They were now just one partner, forced to share the spoils with their American rivals, the Baby Standards and their European sister, Shell. In 1954, in a move of pure public relations, the dynasty erased its own stained name. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a name now synonymous with colonial arrogance and a violent coup, was retired. The company was rebranded with a new, clean, modern, and anonymous name, the British Petroleum Company, or simply BP. This rebranding marked the true beginning of the modern BP dynasty. The company, led by a new generation of professional, faceless managers, had learned a crucial lesson from the Iran crisis. Never again be dependent on a single volatile country. The 1950s and 60s, therefore, became the dynasty's golden age of diversification and collusion. BP, along with its partners, became a pillar of the new global oil cartel known as the Seven Sisters. This was not a conspiracy theory. It was a documented business arrangement. BP, Shell, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, and Texaco, having learned the lesson of the 1901 Northern Pacific Panic, no longer engaged in messy competitive wars. They colluded. They formed joint ventures and consortiums to manage the world's great oil fields, ensuring prices remained high and stable, and that no outsider nation could break their shared monopoly. The BP dynasty's wealth exploded. They expanded their operations from Iran into the new massive fields of Kuwait and Iraq, where they also held massive cartel-like stakes. Their revenue, which had been £5 billion in 1950, skyrocketed by 10 times to over £50 billion by 1970. The dynasty, built on the 1953 coup, was now one of the richest, most powerful, and most stable corporations on Earth. This golden age of imperial old money stability lasted for exactly 20 years, and in 1973, the world broke. The OPEC oil crisis, triggered by the Yom Kippur War, was the second great existential threat to the dynasty. The Arab states, for the first time, realized that they held the real power. They quadrupled the price of oil overnight, and in a move that echoed Mossadegh, they began to nationalize their oil fields. For the BP dynasty, this was a catastrophe. More than any other sister, BP's entire empire was built on Middle Eastern oil. Their British identity was a sham. They were a company with almost no oil of their own. As their assets in Iran, Kuwait, and Libya were seized by the new nationalist governments, the company was once again facing bankruptcy. They were a global giant with nothing to sell. This crisis forced the dynasty into the two most important high-risk gambles of its 20th century history. They had to find safe, non-OPEC oil, and they had to find it fast. Their first gamble was in the United States. In 1968, just before the crisis, a massive discovery had been made in the most remote, hostile environment on Earth, Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. This was a supergiant field, but it was trapped 800 miles from the nearest port, across 3 mountain ranges, and a vast frozen tundra. BP, in a desperate pivot, poured its remaining capital into this Alaskan venture. While the Bechtel dynasty was building the Trans-Alaska Pipeline to move the oil, BP was buying up the rights to the oil itself. By 1977, when the pipeline was complete, BP was the single largest owner of America's oil, a move that would, decades later, give it the leverage to conquer the American market. Their second and even more audacious gamble was in their own backyard, the North Sea. In the 1970s, the North Sea was considered undrillable. It was not a calm gulf. It was a violent, frozen, and lethally deep stretch of ocean. No company had the technology to build a platform that could withstand the 100-foot waves and hurricane-force winds. The BP dynasty, led by its engineers, did it anyway. They pioneered the field of deep-sea drilling. In 1970, they struck the massive Forties field. This was a technological moonshot. They had to invent, from scratch, the engineering needed to build and operate a platform in 400 feet of one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. In 1975, the Forties field began production. It was a staggering 750 million pound triumph. The field would, by itself, produce 500,000 barrels a day, making Britain, for a time, a self-sufficient oil power BP was once again the national champion that had saved the country. These two pivots, Alaska and the North Sea, defined the dynasty's new strategy. They had successfully diversified away from the unstable Middle East and become the undisputed masters of high-risk, high-tech, environmentally hazardous drilling. This new Western focus led to the dynasty's final great consolidation. In 1998, BP, now a supermajor, announced the largest industrial merger in history. It was acquiring the American giant Amoco for $48 billion. This was a brilliant strategic move. It made BP a true global seven-sister, giving it a massive network of American refineries, gas stations, and, most importantly, Amoco's dominant drilling position in the Gulf of Mexico. This new massive BPP Amoco entity needed a new, softer image. The dynasty's dark past of colonialism, coups, and oil spills was a public relations liability. In 2000, the company's new charismatic CEO, Lord Browne, launched one of the most successful and most cynical PR campaigns in history. He announced that BP no longer stood for British Petroleum. It now stood for Beyond Petroleum. He unveiled the new Helios logo, a green and yellow sunburst, a symbol of renewable energy and environmental consciousness. He pledged $8 billion to invest in wind and solar power. He positioned the dynasty not as an oil company, but as a green energy company that was leading the world into a cleaner future. It was a masterpiece of greenwashing. As investigative journalists at The Guardian would later point out, this Beyond Petroleum campaign was a lie. The $8 billion pledged to renewables was a tiny fraction of the company's annual budget, which poured tens of billions into new oil and gas exploration. The Green Division, as late as 2009, accounted for less than 2% of the company's total revenue. The Helios was a mask, a PR facade designed to hide the old, dirty oil and gas business that was still generating 98% of the profits. And behind that Beyond Petroleum mask, the real corporate culture, the one that had been forged in the cost-cutting, high-risk worlds of Alaska and the North Sea, was rotting from within. The 1998 Amoco merger had not just given BP new assets, it had given them Amoco's old, failing, and dangerous infrastructure. And the new BP, obsessed with maximizing its stock price and proving the merger's synergy, had allegedly embarked on a systemic, company-wide campaign of cost-cutting, specifically targeting safety and maintenance. This was the dynasty's new dark past in the making. While Lord Browne was giving speeches about green energy, his managers on the ground were allegedly being rewarded for slashing maintenance budgets and ignoring safety warnings. On March 23, 2005, this rotten culture exploded. The Texas City refinery, an enormous, aging, and badly maintained Amoco plant that BP had acquired in the merger, was the scene of one of the worst industrial accidents in U.S. history. A blow-down drum, a crucial piece of safety equipment, was overfilled with volatile liquid hydrocarbons. A geyser of flammable vapor erupted from the stack. The vapor cloud ignited, triggering a massive explosion that was felt for 5 miles, shattering windows and shaking the ground. The blast killed 15 workers and injured 180 others. The subsequent OSHA investigation was a damning indictment of the BP dynasty. The report found that this was not a freak accident. It was an inevitability. It described a broken and indifferent corporate culture. It found hundreds of safety violations at the plant. It revealed that internal BP audits had repeatedly warned of a catastrophic event at the plant, but that senior management, in their rush to cut costs by 25%, had ignored the warnings. OSHA fined BP a then record $87 million for its systemic safety failures. The Beyond Petroleum mask had been ripped off, revealing the face of a company that, as investigators concluded, put profits over people. But this was only the first warning shot 1 year later, in March 2006. The dynasty's other great asset, the one that had saved it in the 1970s, failed. A corroded pipeline in BP's Prudhoe Bay, Alaska operation, a pipeline that the company had allegedly failed to properly inspect and maintain for years, in another cost-cutting measure, finally burst. It spilled 267,000 gallons of crude oil onto the pristine Alaskan tundra. It was the largest oil spill in North Slope history. The company was once again hit with millions of dollars in fines from the EPA and the Department of Transportation. A whistleblower later testified that he had warned BP management for years about the severe corrosion in that very pipeline, but had been ignored and intimidated by managers who were under pressure to cut maintenance costs. The pattern was now undeniable. This was not a Rouge D employee or a single failure. This was the BP dynasty's system. By 2007, the company had been convicted in the press, in the courts, and by federal regulators of a systemic corporate-wide culture of negligence. They had been proven to put profits ahead of safety, to ignore their own engineers, and to cut costs on basic maintenance, resulting in a massive fatal explosion in Texas and a massive environmental disaster in Alaska. This was the company, this was the dynasty that was, at this very moment, pushing this same broken, cost-cutting culture to its absolute physical limit in the most dangerous environment on Earth, the ultra-deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. They were drilling an exploratory well, a well from hell, that was pushing the boundaries of known physics. It was 40 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The well was called Macondo, and the rig they had hired to drill it, a rig owned by Transocean, was named the Deepwater Horizon. The stage was set for the dynasty's final, greatest, and most predictable catastrophe, the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The 2005 Texas City refinery explosion was not an accident. It was a corporate homicide. The investigation, led by the U.S. Chemical Safety Board and OSHA, had exposed a broken and indifferent corporate culture, a systemic top-down decision to cut safety and maintenance budgets to maximize profits. The $87 million in fines was a record-breaking indictment of the BP family's governance. The 2006 Alaska pipeline spill was not a leak. It was the inevitable result of that same rotten culture. Whistleblowers and investigators proved that BP had ignored years of internal warnings about severe corrosion in its Prudhoe Bay pipelines, all to avoid the cost of routine maintenance. The $25 million fine was another federal condemnation of the dynasty's priorities. By 2009, the BP dynasty was, in the eyes of U.S. regulators, a convicted corporate felon. They were a company with a proven, documented, and lethal history of ignoring their own engineers and prioritizing profits over the lives of their workers and the safety of the environment. And it was this exact company, this exact culture of cost-cutting and arrogance that was, at this very moment, pushing the boundaries of known physics, drilling the deepest, most difficult, and most dangerous oil well in the history of the world. The well was called Macondo. It was a high-risk, high-reward exploratory well drilled in the ultra-deep water of the Gulf of Mexico, 40 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The engineering challenges were staggering. The rig, a semi-submersible platform named the Deepwater Horizon, was floating in 5,000 feet of water. Its drill bit was boring another 13,000 feet below the seafloor into a highly pressurized, volatile pocket of methane gas and oil. This was the frontier. And BP, as the 65% owner and operator of the well, was in charge. The project was a nightmare. It was 6 weeks behind schedule and wildly over budget. Every day the rig was on site, it cost BP and its partners over $1.5 million in rental fees. The pressure from the London headquarters, now led by Lord Brown's successor, Tony Hayward, was immense. The directive was simple: finish the job, stop the bleeding, cut the costs. In March and April of 2010, the Deepwater Horizon rig was in the final, most dangerous phase of its mission, temporarily sealing the well so the rig could move off. And in these final fatal weeks, the BP dynasty, true to its culture, made a series of catastrophic cost-saving decisions that, as the official White House Oil Spill Commission report would later conclude, were the direct cause of the disaster. At every single step, BP's managers on the rig allegedly chose the cheaper, faster, but riskier option over the safer, more expensive, and slower one first. There was the cement. To seal the well, a concrete plug must be pumped to the bottom. BP's partner Halliburton had warned that the specific nitrogen foam cement mix they were using was unstable. Internal Halliburton documents, released later, showed that their own tests had proven the cement would fail, but BP, in a rush, allegedly used it anyway. Second, there was the blowout preventer. This was the 450-ton, 5-story-high fail-safe device on the ocean floor, a stack of massive hydraulic shears designed to slice through the drill pipe and seal the well if a kick of gas erupted. The BOP on the Deepwater Horizon was known to be damaged. One of its key components, a blind shear ram, had failed a test just weeks before repairing. It would have meant pulling up the entire pipe and delaying the project, costing millions. BP and the rig operator Transocean allegedly ignored the failure and continued drilling. The final fatal decision came on the morning of April 20th, 2010. The crew was conducting its final negative pressure test to confirm the well was sealed. The test failed. It showed that the unstable cement plug was leaking, that high-pressure methane gas was seeping into the wellbore. This was the moment the rig should have been shut down, but, as survivors later testified, a bubble of denial had formed. After a confused 10-minute debate, the BP and Transocean managers on the rig chose to ignore the failed test. They dismissed the data as an anomaly. They declared the test a success, and at 8 p.m., they gave the order to continue the sealing process, a decision that would doom the 11 men. At 9:47 p.m., the anomaly reached the surface. A massive bubble of high-pressure methane gas, which had been leaking through the failed cement plug for hours, shot up the drill pipe. It blasted through the rig floor, igniting in a catastrophic, fiery explosion that was seen from 40 miles away. The Deepwater Horizon was instantly engulfed in a 700-foot-high fireball. The blast was a scene of pure apocalyptic horror. 11 men caught in the explosion's core were instantly vaporized. The 115 other crew members were left scrambling for their lives, jumping 100 feet from the burning deck into the dark, oil-slicked water. For 2 days, the rig burned, a funeral pyre for the 11 missing men. Then on the morning of April 22nd, the Deepwater Horizon, the $560 million marvel of modern engineering, capsized and sank, tearing the pipe from the blowout preventer and disappearing beneath the waves. The 11 men were dead, and the well from hell at the bottom of the ocean was now wide open, gushing raw, crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. This was the beginning of the largest environmental disaster in American history. But for the BP dynasty, it was the beginning of a public relations crisis and they responded with the only tool they knew: deception. The company's new CEO, Tony Hayward, immediately flew to the Gulf. His first and most crucial job was to control the narrative. He knew that under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, BP was legally liable for all cleanup costs and damages, and that the fines were calculated per barrel spilled. Therefore, the company's entire strategy was to lie about the size of the spill. In the first days, BP told the U.S. Congress and the public that the well was only leaking 1,000 barrels of oil a day. This was a manageable amount. This was a brazen, calculated lie. The government's own independent scientists, using satellite imagery and sonar, knew the number was far higher. But BP, as the only entity with cameras at the wellhead, controlled the data. They refused to release it. But the dynasty that had operated in the dark for a century had forgotten one thing: the internet. When BP was finally forced by the government to release a live feed of the wellhead, the spill cam, the public could see the lie for themselves. They did not need to be engineers. They could see a black, volcanic plume of oil billowing uncut into the ocean, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Independent scientists used the spill cam footage to calculate the real flow rate. It was not 1,000 barrels. It was over 62,000 barrels a day. BP's 1,000 barrel estimate was not just an error. It was a criminal fraud, an attempt to deceive the public and limit their own financial liability. The spill, which gushed unchecked for 87 days, was a slow-motion catastrophe. BP's attempts to stop it were a public circus of failure. The top hat, a giant containment dome, failed the junk shot. An attempt to clog the well with golf balls and shredded tires failed. The top kill, an attempt to pump heavy mud into the well, also failed. While the well gushed, the environmental holocaust spread. The 4.9 million barrels of oil poisoned over 1,100 miles of coastline from Louisiana to Florida. It created a dead zone on the ocean floor the size of Rhode Island. It killed an estimated 1 million seabirds, thousands of marine mammals, and decimated the Gulf's $65 billion fishing and tourism industries. And as this unfolded, the BP dynasty's family representative, CEO Tony Hayward, gave a masterclass in corporate sociopathy. While Louisiana fishermen were watching their livelihoods dissolve into toxic sludge, Hayward, in an interview, whined, "I'd like my life back." He complained about the modest size of the spill, stating that the Gulf of Mexico was a very big ocean. He was later seen attending a glamorous yacht race off the coast of England while the Gulf was still bleeding. He was not just a CEO, he was a caricature. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the arrogant, indifferent robber baron dynasty. His gaffes were so toxic that they were in themselves a financial liability. The company's stock plummeted by 50%, erasing $100 billion in shareholder value. Hayward was finally forced to resign in July 2010, fired by his own board. But the dynasty's greatest crime during the spill was not the oil itself, it was the cover-up. BP's primary response to the gushing oil was not to collect it, it was to hide it. They deployed an unprecedented 1.8 million gallons of a chemical dispersant called Corexit. Corexit is a solvent, a soap that breaks up the oil slick, but it does not remove the oil. It simply sinks it from the surface, breaking it into small toxic droplets that hang in the water column or fall to the seafloor. This was a public relations strategy, not an environmental one. It was designed to make the surface slicks, the images that the TV helicopters were broadcasting, disappear. But Corexit, as the EPA knew, was itself a toxic substance. And when mixed with crude oil, it became, according to numerous scientific studies, Even more toxic, a chemical cocktail that was devastating to marine life and human health. BP, in its desperation to fix the visual problem, had poisoned the entire water column. They had in effect traded a surface disaster for a deep-sea one, creating a toxic kill zone on the ocean floor that would persist for decades, all to make their spill cam look less bad. On July 15th, 2010, after 87 days, an engineering team finally succeeded in capping the well. The leak was stopped, but the shell curse, the legacy of the BP dynasty, was now complete. The Beyond Petroleum slogan was dead, a global punchline. The company was no longer a green leader. It was the author of the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. The final accounting was brutal. The U.S. government took the dynasty to court. In 2016, BP agreed to the largest environmental fine in history, $20.8 billion paid to the Department of Justice. But this was just the fine. The total cost of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, the cleanup costs, the legal fees, the private settlements, has to date cost the BP dynasty over $65 billion. It was the Argentina crisis of 1890, the Nick Leeson collapse of 1995, and the Chernobyl disaster, all rolled into one. It was the bill for a century of arrogance, coming due. The dynasty that was born in the colonial-era plunder of Iran had, in its fifth generation, met its match, not in a rival, but in the simple, unbreakable laws of physics, and its own corrupt, cost-cutting culture, poisoning the public for profit. The Deepwater Horizon catastrophe of 2010 was not, as the BP dynasty's public relations team tried to frame it, an isolated incident. It was not a freak accident. It was, as federal investigators had proven, the direct, inevitable result of a broken corporate culture that had for decades systemically and deliberately prioritized profits over safety. The $65 billion in costs associated with the disaster was the bill for this culture, a culture that had been revealed in the 2005 Texas City explosion and the 2006 Alaska pipeline spill. But this culture of profits over people was not limited to environmental negligence. It was and is a two-pronged strategy. While one arm of the BP dynasty was cutting costs on safety and maintenance, the other was engaged in a systemic global campaign of corruption to secure its most valuable assets. The 2010s for BP were not just the decade of the Deepwater cleanup. They were also the decade where their other, far older, and far darker dark past finally came to light. The decades-long bribery racket that had secured their empire in the developing world. The Beyond Petroleum slogan was not just a lie, it was a shield, a greenwashing facade designed to distract from a corporate family that was, at its core, as corrupt as the most ruthless robber barons of the Gilded Age. The most damning evidence of this was not in the Gulf of Mexico, but in West Africa. While the world's media was transfixed by the spill cam, investigative journalists and international law enforcement were piecing together a vast conspiracy of bribes and corruption that revealed the true BP system. The most notorious of these scandals, a case that would rival the infamy of Shell's OPL 245 deal, was BP's involvement in Angola. In 2022, the UK's Serious Fraud Office concluded its investigation. The findings were stark. The BP dynasty was ordered to pay a fine of £30 million for systemic corruption in its Angolan operations. The investigation revealed that BP, in its quest to secure lucrative oil and gas contracts, had paid a local agent who had undisclosed personal connections to high-ranking Angolan government officials over $14 million in consulting fees. This was not lobbying. It was, as the SFO laid out, a textbook bribery scheme. The consultant was a ghost, a shell company used to funnel millions of dollars directly to the political elite of Angola, in exchange for which the BP dynasty was granted access to the nation's oil wealth. This was not a one-off payment. This was a system. The SFO found that BP had failed to stop the payments even after internal audits had flagged them as a high risk of corruption, the company knew, and it had continued to pay. This Angolan case was just one piece of a much larger global puzzle. The BP dynasty's dark past of colonial exploitation, the legacy of the 1953 CIA coup in Iran, had never ended. It had simply modernized. It had evolved from using MI6 to topple a prime minister to using offshore bank accounts to bribe one. This culture of corruption was, in fact, endemic to the company's entire post-colonial business model. While BP was publicly divesting from its most toxic assets in the 2000s, it was simultaneously doubling down on this corrupt, high-risk, high-reward strategy. The OPL 245 scandal in Nigeria, while primarily a Shell and Eni disaster, also had BP's fingerprints all over it. While BP was not a primary partner in the 2011 corrupt $1.1 billion deal, their long-standing joint ventures with both Shell and Eni in Nigeria, and their shared history of managing the Nigerian political landscape, made them a key part of the club that had allowed such a deal to be possible. The U.S. Department of Justice, in its own parallel investigations, began to close the net in 2021. BP, as part of a joint investigation with Brazilian and UK authorities, was forced to pay $48 million in fines related to the Nigerian bribery schemes. The dynasty that had portrayed itself as a victim of the corrupt Middle East for 50 years was now being exposed as one of the primary drivers of that corruption. But the most devastating and most personal legacy of the BP dynasty's governance scandal was not in Africa. It was in the United States. The Deepwater Horizon disaster was not just an environmental failure, it was a human one. The first wave of the tragedy was the death of the 11 workers on the rig, men who, as the White House Commission proved, had died because of a failure of management that had prioritized speed and cost-cutting over their lives. But the second wave of the disaster was the poisoning of the cleanup workers. This was the great hidden abuse of the Deepwater Horizon scandal. In the frantic months after the spill, BP, in its desperation to fix the PR nightmare, hired thousands of local fishermen and unemployed residents for the Vessels of Opportunity program. These were the very people whose livelihoods the company had just destroyed. They were sent out into a toxic chemical war zone. BP's primary weapon against the spill was not containment, it was deception. They deployed an unprecedented 1.8 million gallons of the chemical dispersant Corexit. This was a solvent, a soap that breaks up the oil slick, but it does not remove the oil. It simply sinks it, breaking it into small toxic droplets that hang in the water column or fall to the seafloor. This was a public relations strategy, not an environmental one. It was designed to make the surface slicks, the images that the TV helicopters were broadcasting, disappear. But Corexit, as the EPA and scientific community warned, was itself a toxic substance, and when mixed with crude oil, it became, according to numerous scientific studies, even more toxic, a chemical cocktail that was devastating to marine life and human health. BP, in its desperation to fix the visual problem, had poisoned the entire water column. The cleanup workers were the guinea pigs in this massive, uncontrolled chemical experiment. They were working for 12 hours a day in a hot, humid environment, breathing in a fog of evaporating crude oil and atomized Corexit. These workers, according to multiple massive class action lawsuits, were systematically deceived by BP and its private medical contractors. They were allegedly not warned of the true dangers. They were given inadequate safety gear, paper dust masks, and cotton gloves. If they were given gear at all, the health effects were immediate and devastating. Workers began collapsing on their boats. They reported a strange, debilitating sickness that they called the BP flu, dizziness, nausea, persistent hacking coughs, skin rashes that burned like fire, memory loss, and bleeding from the nose and ears. BP's governance response was to deny, deflect, and gaslight. The company's private medical contractors allegedly told the sick workers they were suffering from heat stroke or food poisoning. When workers' personal doctors tried to test their blood for chemical exposure, they were reportedly told by BP that the proprietary formula of Corexit was a trade secret, making it impossible to test for. This was a systemic corporate cover-up designed to prevent the creation of a paper trail that could link the illnesses to the chemicals. The long-term consequences, as documented by the National Institutes of Health in the years following the spill, were a human catastrophe. A massive 10-year, $25 million NIH study of the 33,000 cleanup workers confirmed their worst fears. The exposed workers showed significantly higher rates of chronic respiratory illness, heart problems, neurological disorders, and a 30% higher risk of cancer. This was the dynasty's final gift to the Gulf Coast. It had not just destroyed their livelihoods, it had destroyed their health. It had traded the lives of 11 men on the rig for the long-term, slow-motion poisoning of 30,000 more. And the environmental abuse in the Gulf mirrored the company's legacy in Nigeria. The oil did not disappear. The 200 million gallons of crude now sunk by Corexit created a dead zone on the ocean floor. Scientists found a bathtub ring of toxic, oily slime covering an area the size of Rhode Island, killing off ancient deep-sea coral reefs and poisoning the entire food chain. The 1.1 million miles of coastline that were contaminated were like the Niger Delta given a PR cleanup. BP's teams raked the beaches, removing the visible tar balls, but the oil had soaked deep into the sand and the marshes. Years later, in 2024, scientists were still finding this toxic layer of BP Corexit sludge buried just beneath the surface of the clean beaches, a forever chemical legacy that continues to poison the Gulf's shrimp and oyster fisheries. This, then, was the governance of the BP dynasty in the 21st century. It was a company that, when faced with a crisis of its own making, would lie to the public, poison its own cleanup workers to hide the evidence, and bribe foreign governments to secure its future profits. The British half of the old Shell BP cartel, the respectable partner, had been exposed. The dynasty of Beyond Petroleum was revealed to be a dynasty of pollution, corruption, and systemic criminal negligence, a family that had, in its relentless pursuit of profit, declared war on its own workers and the planet itself. The sacrifice of the CEOs. The BP dynasty was never a family of blood, like the Rockefellers. It was a dynasty of Sun Kings, a 112-year line of succession of all-powerful, often aristocratic chairmen and CEOs. From its 1908 origins, the company's power was embodied by a single visionary patriarch, William Knox Darcy, Winston Churchill, and the Seven Sisters executives who ran it like a private fiefdom, the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, and the subsequent $65 billion reckoning, did more than just bankrupt the company's balance sheet. It broke this line of succession forever. It shattered the imperial CEO model. The story of the dynasty's personal disintegration is the story of three heirs who were, one by one, publicly sacrificed, humiliated, and deposed, all in a desperate attempt to save the family name from the consequences of its own toxic culture. The first and most spectacular personal tragedy was that of Tony Hayward. Hayward was a BP lifer. He was a geologist, a company man who had worked his way up the ranks for 26 years. In 2007, he was appointed CEO. His mission was to be the anti-Lord Brown. His predecessor, Lord Brown, the man who had invented the Beyond Petroleum slogan, had been forced to resign in disgrace after lying in court about his personal life. The dynasty, embarrassed, wanted a no-nonsense, boring engineer to restore its reputation. They wanted a safety guy. Instead, Hayward had inherited the rotten, cost-cutting culture that Lord Brown had perfected. The 2005 Texas City explosion and the 2006 Alaska spill had already proven this culture was lethal. Hayward, the safety guy, was now in charge of a corporate machine that was hardwired to ignore its own safety warnings. For 3 years, he presided over this machine. Then on April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon rig drilling the Macondo well exploded. Hayward, the competent boring engineer, was suddenly thrust into the global spotlight, the public face of the worst environmental disaster in American history, and he proceeded to give a masterclass in corporate sociopathy. His personal, human response to the unfolding Holocaust was so cold, so arrogant, and so disastrously tone-deaf that it became a scandal in itself, costing the company billions in reputational damage. First, he lied about the spill. He, along with the entire BP dynasty, perpetuated the 1,000 barrels a day falsehood, a number they knew was a fraction of the real flow. Second, he minimized the environmental impact. As the Gulf of Mexico was dying, he infamously told the press that the spill was relatively tiny compared to the very big ocean. Third, and most fatally, he showed a profound, almost pathological lack of empathy. As the 11 men were declared dead, as the entire Gulf Coast economy was collapsing, Hayward was filmed complaining with a sigh to a cameraman, "I'd like my life back." This was the quote that destroyed him. It was the "let them eat cake" of the 21st century. It was the voice of the dynasty, a detached aristocratic complaint from a billionaire who was inconvenienced by the apocalypse he had caused. The personal tragedy was that Hayward, the boring engineer, had become the most hated man in the world. He was publicly savaged by the U.S. Congress. He was lampooned on television. He became the face of the disaster. The dynasty, seeing its stock price evaporate due to Hayward's personal toxicity, acted in the cold, ruthless manner of the Severans they purged him. In July 2010, just 3 months after the spill, the London board fired Tony Hayward. He was not given a golden parachute. He was given a public execution. He was forced to resign, losing £1 million in salary and bonuses, and was exiled to a minor non-job at BP's joint venture in Russia. He was the first Sun King to be sacrificed. The dynasty's next heir was Bob Dudley. He was the anti-Hayward. He was an American, a Mississippi-raised oilman, a tough, quiet fixer who had run BP's chaotic Russian operations. He was sent in as the viceroy, the man who could speak to the furious Americans in their own language, and most importantly, manage the financial fallout. Dudley's 10-year reign was not one of growth or vision. It was a decade of retreat, austerity, and disintegration. His entire job was to be the dynasty's undertaker. His personal tragedy was that he was forced to preside over the dismemberment of the empire. To pay the $65 billion in Deepwater Horizon liabilities, Dudley had to launch a dynastic fire sale. He sold off $75 billion worth of the company's crown jewels. He sold the Prudhoe Bay, Alaska fields, the very assets that had saved the dynasty in the 1970s. He sold the Texas City refinery, the site of the 2005 disaster. He sold off assets in the North Sea, in Egypt, in Vietnam. He was, in effect, pawning the dynasty's 100-year history to pay for the sins of its previous generation of managers. Dudley, the fixer, successfully saved the company from bankruptcy. He navigated the $20.8 billion DOJ settlement in 2016. He was the quiet, competent, boring manager. The dynasty had thought it was getting with Hayward, but by 2020, the dynasty faced a new existential crisis: climate change. The world had changed. The soft power of big oil was evaporating. A new generation of investors and activists saw BP not as a partner, but as a pariah. The dynasty, having barely survived its environmental crisis, was now facing a moral one. The family knew that the boring Bob Dudley, the oil man, could not be the face of this new green future. They needed a new kind of leader. They needed a new Lord Brown. They chose Bernard Looney. Looney, an energetic, likable Irishman, was the perfect new money CEO. He was not an old guard aristocrat. He spoke the language of social media, of purpose, and of sustainability. In February 2020, he was appointed CEO. His mission was to be the savior, to rebrand the dynasty for the 21st century, and finally wash away the stains of Texas City, Alaska, and Deepwater Horizon. Looney immediately launched the dynasty's most radical pivot in its 112-year history. He announced a net zero ambition. He stood before the world and declared that BP, the ultimate big oil giant, was no longer an oil and gas company. This was Beyond Petroleum Act 2. But on steroids, Looney announced that BP would cut its oil and gas production by a staggering 40% by 2030. He pledged to pour billions of dollars into building wind and solar farms. He fired 10,000 employees, mostly old-school oil explorers, and began hiring renewable energy experts. It was once again a masterpiece of greenwashing. The global media, desperate for a good oil company, hailed him as a visionary. For 2 years, Bernard Looney was the darling of the climate change world, the good CEO who was getting it. But the dynasty itself, the family of institutional shareholders, and the old guard directors on the board, was not on board. They had just survived the $65 billion Deepwater Horizon collapse. Their only source of profit, the only thing paying the bills, was oil and gas. And in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the price of oil skyrocketed. The dirty business that Looney was trying to shrink was suddenly wildly profitable again. BP, like Shell, was coining money, posting its highest profits in a decade. This created a massive internal dispute. The family was at war with its own heir. The shareholders saw Looney's green plan not as a vision, but as financial suicide. They were, in the words of one analyst, coining money from oil, and their CEO was actively trying to stop doing it, all to build low-profit wind farms. The board, the True family, decided to act. In September 2023, the financial world was stunned by a sudden terse announcement. Bernard Looney was resigning, effective immediately. The official reason was a personal scandal. The board, it was claimed, had received an anonymous tip and launched an investigation. They had found that Looney had failed to disclose a series of past personal relationships with company colleagues he had, in short, lied to the board. This was, in the cutthroat world of corporate politics, almost certainly a pretext. It was a morality firing. The real reason, as became clear just months later, was his green revolution. The board had seized on his personal failings as the clean legal pretext they needed to fire him and reverse his entire strategy. This was the personal tragedy of Bernard Looney. He was the heir who had actually tried to change the dynasty, and the dynasty, in response, had deposed and humiliated him. The family immediately installed a new pragmatic CEO, Murray Auchincloss. And Auchincloss's first act in early 2024 was to publicly gut his predecessor's entire strategy. In a move that horrified environmentalists but delighted shareholders, BP announced it was abandoning its climate goals. It would not be cutting its oil and gas production by 40%. In fact, it would now increase its fossil fuel production to meet demand. The Beyond Petroleum experiment, Act 2, was over. The greenwashing had served its purpose to get the company through the bad press of the 2010s, and now it was back to business as usual. This is the ultimate tragedy of the BP family. It is not a family at all. It is a balance sheet. The dynasty born from the imperial ambitions of Winston Churchill and the colonial greed of William Darcy had no bloodline to disintegrate. It had only a line of succession of CEOs, and, as Hayward, Dudley, and Looney all learned, these heirs were completely expendable, the family response to every crisis. From the 1953 coup to the 2010 spill was to sacrifice the individual to save the corporation. The dynasty's soft power and philanthropic arm, the BP Foundation, operates with the same cold, pragmatic logic. It spends hundreds of millions on STEM education and environmental research at universities like MIT and Cambridge. This is not charity. It is reputation laundering and recruitment. It is an investment to ensure that the BP name is associated with science and progress, not oil spills and dead workers. The family, in the 21st century, had finally dissolved into its purest form, a trillion-dollar financial entity, devoid of loyalty, morality, or a face, whose only family value is the quarterly dividend. Was the U.S. government complicit in the BP cover-up? The British Petroleum dynasty by the 2020s was a corporation under siege. It had survived its 1953 death in Iran by colluding with the CIA. It had survived the 1998 Amoco merger. It had survived the 2005 Texas City explosion and the 2006 Alaska spill. And, most astoundingly, it had survived the $65 billion financial apocalypse of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. The dynasty's 115-year history was a relentless cycle of catastrophic failure, government-backed bailouts, and cynical greenwashed rebranding. This very invincibility, this too-big-to-fail status, created the dark past of the modern BP era. The company's actions were so often disastrous and the consequences so minimal that the public, and indeed many historians, refused to accept the official story. They saw instead a conspiracy. This is the final true legacy of the BP dynasty. It is not just a history of oil spills. It is a history of deep, systemic, and provable soft power, a web of influence so profound that it blurs the line between corporate incompetence and a conspiracy to prioritize profit over human life and national security. The most potent and enduring conspiracy theory surrounding BP is not about its colonial past, but about its modern disasters. The first and most complex theory is that the 1953 Iranian coup was not just helped by MI6 and the CIA, it was orchestrated by the Anglo-Iranian oil company itself. This is the conspiracy that declassified CIA documents, released in 2013, have proven to be substantially true. The official story for 60 years was that the US and UK governments had acted to stop Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh because he was drifting toward communism. The reality, as chronicled by historians like Stephen Kinzer in his book All the Shah's Men, was that this was a corporate assassination AIOC, furious at Mossadegh for nationalizing their Iranian oil fields, had directly lobbied the British government. They did not just ask for help, they demanded a regime change. MI6 was the first to drop the plan, and they then convinced a paranoid, Cold War-obsessed American administration, led by the Dulles brothers, to provide the CIA muscle. This was not a conspiracy theory. It was BP's foundational business model. It was the first unambiguous proof that the dynasty, when its profits were threatened, would use the military and intelligence agencies of Western governments as its own private regime change army. This 1953 coup, which destroyed Iranian democracy and installed the puppet Shah, was the original sin that would ultimately lead to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and 40 years of conflict in the Middle East. The second and more modern set of conspiracies surrounds the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. The official verdict that the spill was caused by a cascade of failures from arrogant, cost-cutting managers was, for many, too simple. It blamed a few mid-level engineers and a broken culture. The darker theories, which still flourish on social media and in investigative blogs, suggest a more sinister, deliberate plot. One theory alleges deliberate sabotage not by BP, but against BP. It posits that rival corporations, or even foreign powers seeking to destroy BP's foothold in the Gulf, may have planted explosives. This theory, which lacks any credible evidence, is fueled by the sheer, unbelievable incompetence of the disaster. A more plausible and more chilling conspiracy is not about the cause of the spill, but about the cover-up. This theory alleges that the U.S. government itself, specifically the Obama administration, was complicit in BP's lie about the spill's flow rate, the evidence. For this is the 1,000 barrel a day figure that both BP and the U.S. Coast Guard promoted for weeks, long after independent scientists using the spill cam had proven the real flow rate was over 60,000 barrels a day. Why would the government repeat BP's lie? The theory suggests a Faustian bargain. The government, terrified that a $100 billion plus fine would bankrupt the company, destroy the entire British pension system, and trigger a global financial crisis, made a deal. They allegedly agreed to publicly downplay the spill's severity, giving BP breathing room to get the well capped, in exchange for BP placing $20 billion into an escrow account. In this version, the Beyond Petroleum dynasty was, once again, too big to fail. Its soft power was so immense that it could allegedly convince the U.S. government to become its partner in defrauding the American public about the scale of the worst environmental disaster in its history. While this cover-up remains a conspiracy theory, the real soft power of the BP dynasty is not in question. It is a documented, measurable force. It is the $5 million that the company spends every single year on lobbying the U.S. Congress, as tracked by open secrets. This money is used to ensure that all climate change legislation is filled with loopholes for natural gas and carbon pricing, policies that benefit BP's new business model, while blocking any laws that would actually harm it. It is the $100 million that the BP Foundation and its corporate arms have poured into American and British universities, funding BP energy research centers at MIT, Cambridge, and Berkeley. This is not charity. It is reputation laundering and intellectual capture. It ensures that the BP name is associated with science and progress, and it allows the dynasty to co-opt the climate change debate, steering it away from the stop drilling message of activists and toward the technological solutions that BP itself will be paid billions to build. And it is the revolving door, the dynasty's oldest and most effective weapon. It was the door that sent George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger from Bechtel into the Reagan cabinet. It is the same door that has seen dozens of high-level BP executives and lobbyists take senior positions within the Department of Energy, the EPA, and the State Department, and vice versa. This is the dynasty's true soft power. It is not a secret conspiracy. It is a fully integrated public-private partnership where the regulators and the regulated are often the same people. This brings us to the final verdict on the BP dynasty. The company, born from a 1901 Persian concession, has come full circle. It was birthed by an act of colonial exploitation, saved by a CIA coup in 1953, and enriched by the cartel-like structure of the Seven Sisters. This culture of imperial arrogance, the belief that it was above the law and that fines are just a cost of doing business, was not fixed after the 1990s. It was doubled down on. The 2005 Texas City explosion and the 2006 Alaska spill were the direct result of this culture. They were not accidents. They were premeditated financial decisions. The company's own internal reports and the later OSHA investigation proved that BP's London leadership had been warned repeatedly that their 25% budget cuts to maintenance would lead to a catastrophic failure. They knew, and they did it anyway. The Deepwater Horizon disaster just 5 years later was the exact same story, but on a larger scale. It was a failure of a $250,000 a day cement job, a failure of a known-to-be-broken blowout preventer, and the failure of BP's managers to listen to the failed pressure tests on the rig. It was a failure driven, as the White House Commission concluded, by a rush to finish, a culture of cost-cutting, and an arrogance that was, by now, the dynasty's defining family trait. The personal tragedy of the BP dynasty is that it has no family to hold accountable. The founding Darcy bloodline is long gone, diluted into quiet British aristocracy. The dynasty is now just a brand name, a corporate shell, run by a succession of expendable non-family CEOs. Lord Brown, the Sun King, who invented Beyond Petroleum, was sacrificed for a personal scandal in 2007. Tony Hayward, the bumbling engineer, was sacrificed for the "I'd like my life back" gaffe in 2010. And Bernard Looney, the green revolutionary, was sacrificed in 2023 for actually trying to implement the Beyond Petroleum promise at the exact moment dirty oil became profitable again. The dynasty, in the end, is not loyal to its leaders. It is loyal only to its stock price. The ultimate brutal legacy of the BP dynasty is not its successes. It is not the Forties field or the Alaska pipeline. Its true legacy is failure. It is the 1953 Iranian coup, which destabilized the Middle East for 70 years. It is the 15 dead workers in Texas City. It is the 11 dead men on the Deepwater Horizon rig. It is the 30,000 cleanup workers poisoned by Corexit. And it is the $65 billion in damages, the largest environmental fine in human history. The Beyond Petroleum slogan was, it turns out, the one single truth the company ever told. The real legacy of the BP dynasty is the world it is leaving beyond its own operations. A world of polluted oceans, toxic soil, a destabilized climate, and a deep, profound, and well-earned public mistrust.